how do we put that into practice in a university setting where we have lots of different disciplines that I think just need a sense of theological integration? Or else, I mean, if we don't do that, if we don't commit ourselves to doing that well, then we need to stop advertising it to prospective students and parents. Amen? So, my own school at Biola, we've committed considerable resources to this. And I think we've realized over the years that we've been involved in this, that what we're doing has been good and a good start, but not nearly enough to equip our faculty to do the kind of meaningful biblical and theological integration with their disciplines that our students are expecting and that our students' parents are paying for. What I'd hope to put a little shoe leather on this afternoon and help you think about this from our experience at Biola University. We've by no means done everything right. We've made plenty of mistakes, but I think our commitment to this is pretty significant, and we've put pretty significant resources behind it to this point. So, just in my own background on this, my field in ethics, social ethics, applied ethics, has given me lots of opportunities to think across the disciplines, because a lot of the disciplines that we have in the university have ethical issues that they face that are unique to their discipline, and they need somebody who's trained in ethics to help them think through this. This is how I got involved in teaching in the business school more than 30 years ago. And I've become sort of informally the theologian philosopher in residence at our business school. I have good friendships with almost all the business faculty. I've been team teaching there for the last 25, 30 years. And I've been forced to understand and to dig more deeply than I probably otherwise would into the disciplines of business and economics. I could have remained a theological ethicist. I could have stayed a moral philosopher and stayed at the 35,000-foot level. But maybe that's the way God has wired me. I'm not wired to do things that don't have a lot of shoe leather on them. And so my field has helped me gravitate nicely toward these other disciplines. And yet I've learned that to be conversant and to actually be helpful, I've got to step into the shoes of the faculty member in the discipline that I'm trying to enter into. And I've been able to do this in business for a long time. I taught bioethics in our nursing program for many years. Got to know what nursing students deal with, some of the things that they wrestle with, some of the hard choices that they have to make as nurses. I also have taught media ethics. It's been a while since I've done that, but I was forced to enter the world of media and journalism. And I found all of these to be really enriching, professionally wonderful experiences. But I recognize that not everybody has a field that's naturally as inclined as that to interacting with the other disciplines. So let me just what I want to do here is make a couple of introductory observations, and I want to spend a good bit of our time just telling you a story about a longtime faculty colleague who came to grips with his own state university PhD education, taught for 20 years in a state university, then came to a Christian college and was expected to have a rigorous biblical and theological integration in his courses. And I'll read you the story that he tells himself. It's a very compelling account of what he wrestled with and how challenging it was for him to become as equipped as he wanted to be in his field to do theological integration, even though he wasn't trained in biblical studies or in theology. So just a couple of observations here from the start. This is just from my experience. Faculty define integration very, very differently. In fact, my experience has been when you ask a faculty member what they mean by theological integration with their field, it is all over the map. And it ranges from something as simple as praying before their class starts. Okay, I've had some people tell me that that's really all they know about it and all they think it constitutes. I've tried really hard to persuade them to know there's considerably more to it than that. Some faculty look at this as just having a little devotional time before class where they minister to students' spiritual lives, thinking that that's sufficient integration, when in reality we've had to tell them, no, that's a good start, but that has actually nothing to do with the discipline that you're going to be teaching most of the class time with. Others look at this as superficial proof texting is sufficient. Others view the sole goal of integration as evangelism. And though all of those, proof texting is not necessarily a bad thing, evangelism is certainly something we want to encourage, but those are all wildly incomplete views of what we mean by the concept. Second observation is that faculty who come to a university setting, and I think this may be in some degree true at a seminary as well, with a secular state university PhD, which I think is generally a good thing, and we ought to be encouraging that. Because I don't want our faculties to be ingrown nor feel like they've been educated in an echo chamber. And I think to help our students engage with a culture that thinks really differently about a lot of the issues we hold dear requires faculty who have been forced to interact with people who think really differently about the things that we hold dear. And I know of no better place to do that than in a state university or a secular PhD program where you are forced to defend your views rigorously or else you get your head beat in. Amen? Okay. So let me tell you my colleague's story. I think what you'll hear in this is that what he learned in his state university doctoral program, so much of that was just part of the air that he breathed. And it was just it was taken for granted, and most of it went unchallenged. Not even publicly, it went privately unchallenged as well. Here's the way he puts this. And this is it's a fairly lengthy account, but I think it's a pretty compelling story. I received my baccalaureate education in English literature at Wheaton College and felt myself well equipped to enter a secular university graduate program. However, no formal educational experience can effectively prepare a person for the challenges of living cross-culturally. That's what he described his doctoral program as. Entering the Department of Anthropology at the University of Pittsburgh, I found only one person sympathetic to my Christian experience, a fellow graduate student whose mother had been a follower of Bishop Fulton Sheen. You can draw whatever conclusions you want from that. The faculty stated openly and unequivocally that religious commitments had no place in the science of society, although religious beliefs and experience were a legitimate subject for research by anthropologists. Research, I might add, with a distinct bias built in. A few of the faculty expressed open hostility toward Christianity. During my 3 years of graduate education, I learned to be very quiet about my Christian faith and very selective about whom I might share privately my personal beliefs. He was in a doctoral program in the late 70s, early 1980s. And I would suggest that the state university, secular university doctoral scene is much more hostile to Christian faith today than it was back when he was a doctoral student. Perhaps more importantly, my PhD mentor told me gently, as part of his professional, quote, support, that my religious background was irrelevant to my professional life, and that he intended to guide me to become the best anthropologist I could be. It was clear that religion and faith had nothing to do with this mission. After a few traumatic experiences, one in particular with physical anthropology, I accepted the naturalist and evolutionary paradigm as the only one acceptable in the profession for the study of human life and culture. I left the University of Pittsburgh with degree in hand to launch my teaching career in a college of the State University of New York, committed more or less to the doctrines of human and cultural evolution as taught to me by my professors. And I might add, in conversation with this colleague at a later date, I learned that he rarely, if ever, thought about challenging the presuppositions and methodologies that he had been taught, and viewed his Christian worldview as essentially irrelevant to that. So he goes on to put it like this: in the early years of my academic tenure in SUNY, the State University of New York, I parked my Christianity quietly in a closet and ignored this aspect of my personal history and life. In this setting, all of my colleagues were non-Christian, and once again, religion was a subject to be studied, but certainly not a life to be lived. For 15 years, I nurtured habits as a scholar and teacher in the Department of Anthropology, conducting research, writing, and teaching without reference to my Christian heritage or faith. My wife and me attending the Summer Institute of Linguistics in 1975, where I met two men, Marvin Mayers and William Merrifield, both competent anthropologists and committed Christians. Our conversations led to my reconsideration of the Christian faith and a renewed commitment to the Lord Jesus Christ. When I returned to the State University of New York, I faced the dilemma of how to nurture this renewed Christian faith and at the same time continue my professional relationships in anthropology. I resolved to keep my Christian faith private and continue my professional relationships as they had been before, unchanged. I might add at this point, too, that his wife was also a professional anthropologist and walking essentially the same journey as he did. So what they both experienced was mutually reinforcing. When invited to join the faculty at Biola University, I came thoroughly indoctrinated in the naturalism and empirical perspectives of secular anthropology. Excuse me. For nearly 2 decades, I had effectively compartmentalized my life so that my faith had nothing to do with my professional practice. Suddenly, in a Christian institution, students and colleagues expected me to integrate my faith in my academic discipline. Habits of 20 years are not easily broken. My first few years at Biola were somewhat rocky for my students and me. That I think, is the understatement of the day. These students had obvious expectations about what they should be getting in a Christian college. And at times, I think it'd probably be fair to say at most times, I did not fulfill those expectations. One of my students, for example, complained bitterly that she had left a community college and came to Biola specifically to avoid the kind of teaching that I offered in introductory anthropology. I think that was a bit of a wake-up call. Encouraging her to bear with me, I assured her of my personal commitment to the Lord Jesus Christ and promised that she would find perspectives in my class not taught at the community college. However, at that time, I was hard-pressed to explain what it meant to teach from a Christian perspective and worldview. At the same time, the dean of our School of Intercultural Studies arranged for monthly meetings between our faculty and the faculty of our School of Theology. Over the next 2 years, we gathered for monthly dialogue. Individuals in each school prepared and presented papers for discussion by the group. I cannot speak for the others, but the substantive change in my thinking occurred over the 3 years which followed. Beginning to get the pattern here that there's sort of 1 year of interaction with colleagues in a Christian setting per year that he spent in his secular doctoral program. By the end of my 4th year at Biola, I had experienced a significant paradigm shift in my thinking about culture and anthropological research. grappling with the fact that my anthropological presuppositions frequently contradicted my understanding of the Scriptures, I had to decide my priorities for each of the sources of knowledge. No longer comfortable with the compartmentalization that had characterized my career, and bringing these two fields together, I reached the conclusion that my anthropology had to be redefined in reference to my Christian faith. I began to rethink my approach to the field of anthropology from this theological point of view. Everything I have written in subsequent years has been profoundly influenced by this paradigm shift. The teaching in all my courses has taken a substantive new direction. After a 5-year journey, I had finally begun the task of integrating my faith and my academic discipline and teaching the subject of social anthropology from a Christian perspective and worldview. Now let that sink in for a minute. After a 5-year journey, I had finally begun, not finished, I'd begun the task of integrating my faith and my academic discipline and teaching the subject of social anthropology from a Christian perspective and worldview. Now, I don't think his experience is all that unusual. With the faculty that I've encountered, I serve as Dean of Faculty for the School of Theology. I also serve as Senior Advisor to the President, and so I'm involved with faculty across the university. I don't think that my colleagues' here experience that I've shared is all that unusual. What's unusual, I think, is his commitment and perseverance in the journey to actually take this seriously and do this well. And so what I'd like to do is to spend a little bit of time thinking about how we institutionalize this in ways that are practical and in ways that aren't going to sink the average faculty member who's already stretched way too thin. Okay? And so if you're thinking, look, I'm not game for a 5-year journey on this, I understand. But take heart, I don't think that's necessary. I think he was overcoming 25 years of compartmentalization. And so actually to do that in 5 years, I think actually he did that pretty quickly, given where he had come from. So we think about it like this. There we go. My experience is that doctoral students in secular settings, for most of their time in their program, they have to keep their heads down about their faith because they are dealing in settings where the views of faculty and their colleagues, other doctoral students, will view Christian faith either as entirely irrelevant to anything academic or will be openly hostile to that. And then, as a result of that, the chances are pretty high that they've given minimal thought to what the touch points are with their discipline and their Christian worldview. Because frankly, most of us who study in secular university settings, we've got our hands full just trying to finish the full degree and get out. And integrating this with our faith is something that we think about, maybe we'll do this later when I've got a little space in my life. Then we get into the first few years of teaching where if we're 2 steps ahead of the hounds, we're counting our blessings. And, then we're thinking about publishing and tenure, if you have that in your situation. And then all of a sudden you're sort of mid-career before you start thinking about some of this. At the same time, we ask them to come to our place with a rigorous commitment to do integration and to do it well. What we're expecting is a level of expertise in biblical and theological integration that my colleague, whose story I told, had after a 5-year journey. because we're advertising to prospective students and their parents that this is precisely what we're going to do. And what we discovered is that the newer faculty, younger faculty who come to us, they have the inclination to do this, but generally not the aptitude. Most of them don't know what this means and don't know how to get started at doing this. They understand that the integration part, this is why they're on our campuses. This is why they're attracted to come and join us. But they don't know how to get started with this. And I think part of the reason is no one has taught them to do this. And I think the chances are very high that none of their academic mentors has modeled this for them, unless they're doing doctoral study in a distinctively Christian institution. Okay? Now, I want faculty who have PhDs from state universities for the academic credibility they provide and for the opportunity to mix it up at a rigorous level with people who are coming from entirely different places than our folks are. But I think we need to be aware that that comes with a cost institutionally. And it's not just that, you know, some of the air they breathe in those doctoral programs contributes to mission drift in our institutions. It's that we have, the cost is that we come with the obligation to provide a level of training and expertise and education about theological integration with their discipline that I don't think that many of our institutions have taken as seriously as we need to. Now, another obstacle in this area comes from the biblical studies and theological side of the house. My experience is that most theologians and scholars in biblical studies have fairly insular training. And as a result, we often assume that if you put biblical studies and theologically minded folks in the same room with folks in other disciplines, they're just going to know how to put all this stuff together. In reality, I don't think that's true. And I'm not persuaded that just having an advanced degree in biblical studies or theology automatically qualifies you to be of much help in this area. We'll talk in a bit, we'll talk a little bit about how to make yourself, if you are on the theological side of the house, how to make yourself a bit more useful to folks in other disciplines. In my experience, the theological side of the house is not often of great help in this area. Because for the most part, they haven't been trained and often are not that interested in any other discipline besides their own. I found this to be particularly true for those who have studied at the doctoral level in Europe, where it's even more specialized and more narrow than doctoral training in the United States. Now, I think not only does their training not help with this, but their guild requires an increasing degree of specialization, and establishing an academic niche for young scholars often reinforces this. And they're very good in their field, but they have been taught to narrowly specialize, and as a result, there's no real incentive out there for faculty who have been trained in specialty areas in theology and biblical studies to reach more broadly beyond their disciplines, not even in the theological side of the house, not to mention beyond that. And as a result, they typically don't think naturally in integrative terms. Now, I know some theologians are different than that, and God bless you if you have in your institution folks who are wired more in this way. My experience with the overwhelming majority of scholars in biblical studies and theology is that they are not wired in this way, and their plate is too full in their field for them to have the space or the inclination to delve much beyond it. And I think one of the key questions is, how can theologians and biblical studies faculty be better educated about the other disciplines in the university? So I think in our deans and our leadership also need to think a lot more specifically about how they can incentivize this kind of cross-disciplinary interaction. That I see, we operate in Christian institutions largely like we do in state university ones, in academic silos. And the reason is our silo is so full. I mean, our plates are so full with what's just in our silo. And the thought of stepping out of that into another silo is a little bit overwhelming, and I think understandably so. Now, in my view, it's very helpful to have what I would refer to as a robust theology of vocation that underlies your pursuit in your own discipline. The way that cashes out in an academic setting is that there's no hierarchy of disciplines. That's more important to kingdom work than others. Now, I think part of this comes from my own work in our business school, which has, typically in Christian institutions, the business school is sort of seen as the bottom of the barrel when it comes to actually being engaged in kingdom work, which I think is a misreading of a theology of vocation and a misapplication of that. Now, my own experience, I'm grateful my field lends itself to this cross-disciplinary work. And often I think I get some criticism in my own field for it not being quite as rigorous as, say, metaphysics or epistemology or some other meta-ethics or some other 360 view academic discipline. What I tell my students, for example, in bioethics, which we talked about this morning, that my experience in bioethics requires being conversant in at least 5 different areas of specialization. I have to be conversant with theology, philosophy, with academic medicine, medical practitioners, and the law and legal literature. Okay? So, you sort of pick your poison on this and decide, which of these areas do you want to be conversant in. And I'm not saying I'm an expert in all of these, but I've had to be conversant with all of these areas of specialty in order to be reputable in bioethics. And in business ethics, it's exactly the same, except it's the business literature and business practitioners. So I think there's, it's helpful, that experience I think has been helpful, but I realize that not everybody's field lends itself to that. So here's just a couple of questions. First of all, what do we mean? Let's make sure we're on the same page on this. What do we mean by integration? And at Biola, we've expanded the traditional definition of this to make it twofold. First of all, integration is recognizing and establishing the touch points between the Bible and theology and other disciplines in the university. What are those points of contact? And our discussion in the last couple of days on the image of God, I think, has provided a really helpful place to start. For example, in my teaching in business and economics, in conjunction with our School of Business, the notion that human beings are made in the image of God is such an important touch point with the way economists view their own anthropology. They view human beings as homo economicus, simply economic engines that operate strictly on the basis of rational self-interest. Okay? It has nothing to do with the theological component that we bring to the table. And so our theological and economic anthropology provides a very natural touch point for conversations between economists and theologians, and a place for economists to think critically about their discipline from the perspective of a Christian view of the world. But a second meaning of integration, I think, is just as important. This applies to the seminary and the biblical studies and theology folks. And that is establishing that connection between what we do in the classroom in biblical studies and theology and a student's spiritual formation. We increasingly, I think, are seeing our biblical studies and theological faculty as purveyors of spiritual formation for their students. Because if theology and biblical studies is actually meant to be lived, then doing our classroom work without attending in some way, shape, or form to how that should impact the spiritual formation of our students, I think we're doing an incomplete work in terms of integration there. And if we're not going to do that, then we need to stop advertising to prospective students and their parents that that's something that we're going to be about. I think it's unfair and too burdensome to leave that part simply to the co-curricular side of the house. Because even though, in my judgment, the co-curricular side has a whole lot to say and a whole lot of impact, but I don't think they are ever intended to replace the role of the faculty in shaping the spiritual life in the formation of students. So let me suggest a handful of what I would consider necessary steps to develop a culture of integration institutionally. And I'm a dean as well, so I've had to live with these suggestions too. I know what they cost, and they're not cheap, but nobody said that doing this kind of integration well was going to be inexpensive. First off is, in my view, there is no substitute for genuine team teaching, where you have a faculty member from the biblical studies, theological, philosophical side of the house, and somebody from the discipline. And both of them are in the classroom every class period. And here's the kicker. Both of them get full unit credit in their teaching load for team teaching that class. Now, I know most of your CFOs will say, that's a non-starter. And if that's true, then I think we have reason to ask some really hard questions about how committed as an institution we are to doing this well. The way we do this at Biola is not satisfactory in my view. We give a small stipend to the biblical studies and theology person for being in the classroom all of the time. The only bonus they get is they don't have to do any of the grading. But that's a big commitment for a very small stipend. Okay? Second, here's another one that I think we have to incentivize institutionally. Biblical studies and theology faculty being willing to learn substantively about another discipline other than their own. I had to learn about business. I had to learn about economics. And my economics major in college was way too long ago to be resurrected to be helpful in that. I'm looking for who of our faculty are interested in learning more about the discipline of sociology or the discipline of nursing or some of the disciplines in the sciences. Not that you have to be experts in this, but you have to know enough to be conversant and credible with the people who are the experts in those. One of the ways to do this, we've discovered, is these interdisciplinary reading groups. I'm so glad that came up in the last session, because I think that's one of the best ideas, to incentivize it, provide meals, provide a generous stipend for the faculty who participate in this, give them promotion points, credit for it, for participating in this, and give them the time in their schedules to where they can have substantive conversations about what they're reading. And then a fourth that I would suggest is really important. This is more how we go about doing this. A hermeneutic of trust that operates within clear theological boundaries. I don't think you can have one without the other. This is why I was so pleased that Nathan made it so clear that you have to have theological boundaries that are well-defined, well set out, and everybody rowing in the same direction with the institution's fundamental theological commitments. Because if I don't know if you've signed your contract, with your fingers crossed behind your back, I don't know that I can trust you when it comes to the kind of substantive interaction that we want to have with these cross-disciplinary groups. And then further, I think more how we do this. You will have disagreement. I was in one of these faculty reading groups on economics, and we had free market libertarians and socialists in the room at the same time. And it was amazing to me that they didn't wring each other's necks. And they were tempted. I thought they were going to come to blows at some point. But to disagree with understanding and with civility. We have a ground rule among our faculty that we don't quite follow as often as I wish we did. But you are not allowed to critique somebody else's position, somebody else's view, until you have restated that view back to them to their satisfaction. And you listen and ask questions until you can do that, and you bite your tongue on critique until you have adequately restated their position to their satisfaction. Then they know that they've been understood. In addition, I think we need to avoid the genetic fallacy, which is a sophisticated guilt by association view, where we condemn the content of people's work simply by virtue of where they've come from or what they represent. And I think to do that, we recognize the place of common grace and general revelation, that God has equipped everyone, regardless of their worldview or faith commitment, to make a contribution to the pursuit of truth. And even though I think, somebody like Karl Marx was wrong about a lot of important things, Marx was not wrong about everything. Nobody I'm aware of was wrong about everything. In the same way, nobody, regardless of how they're educated and where they came from, is right about everything. We all have things that we can learn from people who have expertise outside of our own. Now, what comes with that is the willingness for people in disciplines outside the realm of theology and biblical studies to be willing to look critically at their own discipline, to be willing to examine the presuppositions and methodologies of their discipline from the perspective of a Christian worldview. So let me make this even a little bit more specific. These are a series of questions that I would be asking to prospective faculty, faculty who are coming up for tenure or for promotion. And I think these can also be used just in casual conversations between faculty of different disciplines as they try to get a little bit more understanding. One is, how do you understand the concept, the integration of Christian faith and your discipline? To be very clear about what they mean by that so that we make sure that we're on the same page. Second, what do you see as the highest priorities for a scholar working under the lordship of Christ in your particular field? Okay? I think that's a good question that I don't know that too many folks are forced to wrestle with. Third, how does your approach to your particular discipline help students capture a vision that the Christian worldview is true and good? Fourth, I think my battery's going, there we go. How does your approach to your discipline in your teaching and writing both cause students and readers to grow in the confidence that Christianity as understood by historic Christianity is true and rational? Because that's what we're advertising to prospective students and their parents, that they are going to leave our institution more mature and more confident in their faith than when they entered our doors previously. Fifth, what things in your discipline seem to be reasonable and support a Christian worldview? And then the more important question, how do you showcase these to your students? Okay. And then just a handful more. What specific presupposition, methodologies, and trends in your field of study, if any, do you find consistent with the Bible in a historic Christian worldview? And then on the flip side, What specific worldview presupposition, methodologies, or trends, if any, do you find to be inconsistent with the Bible and a historic Christian worldview? How would you showcase these to your students? I think what's really important is that we enter these conversations with humility, and especially I think those of us from the biblical studies, theological side of the house, not enter these conversations as though we've got all the integrative answers for people. That sort of, we can't come to this as though we're the experts in a Christian worldview and we're going to show you how to do it. I think we need to come to these conversations recognizing that we have a lot to learn about your discipline. In fact, my guess is that most of our faculty in these various disciplines have thought more about the Bible and theology than we've thought about their discipline. And so we need to come to this with a mode of humility, a mode of listening, a mode of desiring to learn, really eager to learn, and without appearing like we've got all the answers or in any kind of condescending way. Because nothing will cut off conversation quicker than that. And then finally, how will your students see you in your discipline as distinctly and robustly Christian, both in your life and teaching? What we want to get away from are faculty who are committed to their guild first and foremost, and the institution that they teach in is more just a place to do that. We want them committed to our institution first and to our mission first, and then secondarily to their guild. But they need to see themselves as contributing to our mission first and foremost. I want to recommend to you, and David, you can probably say a little bit more about this, but that series of volumes that you edited, and it's probably a dozen or so on them. They're brief introductory volumes introducing a Christian worldview to the various academic disciplines. That's a super helpful place to start. And then I would urge us to be committed to this integrative task. And for those of you in biblical studies and theology, be committed to learning more about a particular discipline. God may not be moving you in that direction, but I hope somebody in your institution is feeling led by the Spirit to move in that direction.